Chapter 1. The doctor was deep in thought. Nissa could tell as soon as she entered the console room. She had heard the melodious chime that meant they had landed while she was in the TARDIS corridor. Now she could see that the central column of the control console had come to a halt. The doctor was leaning over the console, staring across it through the misted transparency of the central column. A single line creased his apparently young brow as he gazed into the empty middle distance. As Nissa watched from the doorway, the doctor shook his head suddenly, sending his blonde hair into a frenzy as he set off rapidly round the console. He was muttering under his breath, consulting instruments, and frowning at readouts. Tegan's voice came from close to Nissa's ear. Her friend was standing right behind her. "Have we landed?" "Yes," Nissa stood aside to let Tegan into the room, "but I'm not sure we're where the doctor intended." "So, what's new?" Tegan positioned herself so that the doctor could not help but notice her as he started another circuit of the console. "Ah, Tegan," he said, as he almost ran into her. "Good, yes, we've landed." He plunged his hands deep into the pockets of his long cream-coloured jacket and peered over Tegan's shoulder at the console. "We can see that, Doctor," Nissa said as she joined them by the console. The doctor pulled his hands from his pockets and tapped an absent-minded tattoo on the nearest control panel. "Only," he said quietly. Then he suddenly stopped tapping his fingers and peered closely at the controls on the panel. "Only what, Doctor?" For a moment he did not move. Then he straightened up, his face creasing into the frown of a late schoolboy with no excuse. "We're not where we should be," he said, as if totally surprised. "We guessed that," Tegan told him. The doctor asked in a pained voice. "Where are we then?" Nissa asked him before they could start arguing over the exact percentage of accurate landings the doctor had recently accomplished. The doctor turned sharply towards Nissa. "I don't know," he said, as if the question had only just occurred to him. "I'll try the scanner," Nissa offered. It showed nothing. "It's just black," Tegan said, earning a scowl from the doctor and a shrug from Nissa. "Perhaps it is just black outside. A void of some sort." "No, Nissa, the scanner's playing up, that's all." The doctor closed the scanner screen and waved a hand dismissively at the control console. "It'll sort itself out soon enough." "What will?" "What? Oh, relative dimensional stabilizer failed. It's happened before, so the TARDIS will know how to fix it. Then we can be on our way." "As simple as that?" Tegan did not seem convinced. Well, no, actually, not quite." "Thought not." "We need to recalibrate. Won't take a moment," the doctor grinned, "once we have the data." Tegan looked from the doctor to Nissa. Since the doctor did not seem about to elaborate, Nissa explained. "We need to know where we are so we can work out how to get back on course." She hoped she had understood the problem. "Quite right, Nissa. Where and when. Once we know that, we can have another go." "So we have to go outside?" The doctor nodded. "Exciting, isn't it?" He reached for the door control, and the main doors swung heavily open. "Come on, you two." The doctor already had his Panama hat in hand. He stuck it on his head as he pushed past Nissa and Tegan to get to the doors. "Where's your sense of adventure?" "Mine died a long and lingering death somewhere in Amsterdam," Tegan said quietly to Nissa. "Where's yours?" "I'm not sure I ever had one," Nissa replied. But she followed them out of the TARDIS anyway. The room was large and unlit. The only illumination was the moonlight which spilled in through the dusty windows. As she peered into the gloom, Tegan could make out dark shapes along the length of the room. A black river flowed round them, and as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could see that it was a carpet. It traced a route through and around the shapes. The doctor was already making his way down the room, peering at shadows. As she watched, he removed a pair of half-moon spectacles from his top pocket and put them on. Tegan made to follow him, conscious of Nyssa beside her. Something caught at her hand, just for a second, then let go. Immediately, Tegan gasped in surprise and jumped back. Beside her, Nyssa laughed. "It's just a rope, Tegan." "I can see that." And so she could. Now. The rope stretched along the side of the carpet, cordoning off the area outside it. To get to the carpeted path, they had to step over the rope. As they made their way after the doctor, Tegan saw that the rope was strung between low posts along the way. She was beginning to understand where they were. "They're caskets," Nyssa said as they reached the first of the larger shadows. The central aisle of the room was a line of similar shapes. They were all open caskets, about 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, and each seemed to contain a body. Nyssa was examining the nearest casket. "The body is wrapped in some sort of protective covering," she pointed out. "I think it must be an advanced process derived from cryogenics, a way of preserving a body so that it can be later restored to life." This time, Tegan laughed. She was glad that for once she knew more than Nyssa about something. "Advanced process? I don't think so." "Oh, be charitable, Tegan." Somehow the doctor had popped up between them and was staring into the casket. "The process is pretty advanced, considering, and the basic idea was exactly as Nyssa said. They thought the soul was reunited with the body after burial, so the body had to be preserved to endure the rigours of the afterlife." Tegan's eyes had adjusted enough to the dim light for her to be able to see Nyssa's smirk. "Doctor, they're mummies," she said. "Whatever Nyssa thinks, we're in a museum full of sarcophaguses and ancient Egyptian stuff." "Sarcophagi," the doctor admonished. "But you're right." They looked around again, able now to see rather more clearly. The sarcophagi formed a row down the centre of the room. Along the sides of the room, more caskets and sarcophagi stood upright. The TARDIS was almost at one end of a wall, just one more box in a large collection of strange-shaped caskets. Dotted about the room were low tables, each with one or more objects standing symmetrically upon it. The objects ranged from statuettes to urns, from glass cases of jewellery to fragments of papyrus. "And this is not just a museum," the doctor continued. "This is the museum, at least as far as Earth is concerned." He slowly turned a complete circle, surveying the room with apparent pride. "This is the Egyptian room of the British Museum." He set off down the room again. "All we need to know now is the time," he called back over his shoulder. "It's night time," Tegan called after him, "and it's cold." She was still wearing the camisole top and thin shorts she had taken to Amsterdam. They had been fine there, but she was conscious now that they were really little more than glorified underwear. "Did they really think they would revive in an afterlife?" asked Nyssa. "After this?" She gestured at the bandaged figure lying in the coffin in front of them. "Guess so," Tegan shivered. "Made for some good films, though. Mummies lurching to life and staggering after their victims." She made a clumsy lunge for Nyssa, who giggled and stepped out of the way. "If he's going to be much longer, I'll have to get a coat." Tegan watched as the doctor moved slowly amongst the relics and jotted odd notes on a small pad that had appeared in his hand. "Aren't you cold?" she asked Nyssa. Nyssa shook her head. She was wearing brown corduroy trousers and what appeared to be a matching velvet tunic. Tegan came to her decision. "Right," she said. "I'll be back in a minute." She nodded towards the distant figure of the doctor. "Don't let him wander off," she told Nyssa. Then she headed back towards the TARDIS, pausing only to curse at the low loop of rope she tripped over on the way. Nyssa smiled as she saw Tegan trip against the rope again. She returned her friend's embarrassed wave and watched her enter the TARDIS. Turning her attention back to the bandaged body in the sarcophagus in front of her, Nyssa wondered about the rituals and beliefs of the culture that took such care of their dead. She tried to estimate the age of the corpse and then of its coffin, but she soon gave up, blaming both the bad light and her lack of background information. She would examine a couple of the other artifacts and then ask the doctor. If she felt confident enough, she might even hazard an estimate of the age of one of the relics. The first piece that Nyssa looked at more closely was a bracelet which lay on one of the tables by the aisle. It was large and heavy, hinged to open outwards and close around the wrist or perhaps the lower arm. As she twisted it to catch the moonlight, Nyssa could see that it was gold, inlaid with a blue enamel which she did not recognize. On one half was a picture. It seemed to show a child perched on top of a clump of leaves. The figure held a staff with a looped top and wore a headdress adorned with a rearing snake. The picture was framed by the twisted shapes of two other snakes, their tails meeting above the child's head. The background was faded and worn, but the relief work itself was well preserved and delineated. If she looked closely enough, Nyssa could even see the line of the mouth where the figure held its finger to its lips, as if asking her to keep silent. She carefully replaced the bracelet on the table, none the wiser. A larger object might yield more clues. Nyssa made her way to a sarcophagus standing upright against the wall. The sarcophagus was larger than she had expected, a good 2 feet taller than Nyssa. It seemed to be made of wood and was carved into roughly the shape of a person, presumably of its occupant. Nyssa guessed from the relative sizes of the casket she had already seen and of its occupant that there was plenty of space inside even when the casket was full. The real person would have been nowhere near as big as their coffin. A stream of moonlight illuminated the side and top of the sarcophagus. This was partly why Nyssa had been drawn to it, and she could see that the face painted on the head section was of a woman. The rest of the body was adorned with small pictures of animals and birds. There were also several human figures with the heads of other creatures. A single pattern, a stylized eye, recurred across the ornate coffin. An eyebrow looped above it as if in surprise, and 2 lines fell away from it. One was perpendicular to the eye, the other slid off to the left at an angle, thinning out before ending in a solid circle as large as a pupil. In the glinting, dusty moonlight, they looked to Nyssa like tears across the front of the coffin lid. It did not take Nyssa long to decide that she had no chance of deciphering the symbols and pictures without help. Instead, she turned her attention to the face of the dead woman. She had to stand on tiptoe and lean forward over the extended feet jutting out from the base of the casket. Half the face was in shadow, but she could see the rest of it quite clearly. She could see the wide, staring eyes and high eyebrows, the painted cheekbone and soft line of the nose. She stared at the flaking lips, turning up slightly even as a dimpled line shadowed down from the corner of the mouth. She reached up and ran her hand over the flat paint of the curled dark hair that cascaded down from a central parting to hang unevenly over the artificial shoulders. And she felt a cold trickle of fear run its course from the nape of her neck down her spine. Tegan was wearing the longest, heaviest cloak she could find in the TARDIS wardrobe. She had considered changing her clothes completely, but she was not at all sure she trusted the doctor to hang around for the length of time it might take to find something suitable. So she was wrapped entirely in a black cloak of some thick worsted material, the heavy hood pulling at her shoulders as it hung loose about her neck. Her first problem was negotiating the rope she remembered all too well was strung across her path. She had to hoist the cloak up and over with each leg. Once on the other side of the rope, she congratulated herself on the operation, smoothed the cloak back down to her ankles, and looked round for the doctor and Nyssa. She could see neither. But then, as her eyes adjusted again to the gloomy light, she made out a figure towards the far end of the room. As she watched, it straightened up, silhouetted for a moment against the lighter doorway in the end wall. It stuffed its hands into its trouser pockets and turned slowly one way, then back the other. Tegan smiled and set off towards the doctor. She was about halfway there when she caught sight of movement from the corner of her eye. Her immediate thought was that it was Nyssa, examining some other artifact. But it was not a person, nor of a momentary glow. She stopped and turned back towards the light source. But there was nothing there, just another sarcophagus standing by the wall. It was tall and wide, shaped like an upright figure just as all the others were. The arms were crossed over the chest, each holding a staff. The headdress over and around the face was alternate lines of black and a lighter colour, but it was too dark for Tegan to make out any details. She watched it for a moment. The sarcophagus stood silent, still and lonely. Just as Tegan was about to move on, she became aware of a faint humming sound. It was not unlike the background noise in the TARDIS console room. She looked round to see where it was coming from. Had the TARDIS door swung open behind her, perhaps caught and kept ajar by her cloak? But the door was not open, and the sound was coming from behind her. From the sarcophagus. From the sarcophagus, which was now lit with an eerie inner light that seemed to emanate from the lighter strips of the headdress and spill out down the rest of the body. The strobing blue light mesmerized Tegan for a second. It held her attention and her mind. Then, just as she broke free of the image and found her voice, the light cut out. "Doctor!" she called across the room. Her voice echoed over the relics and skidded across the coffins. In the distance, the doctor's silhouette turned sharply in the direction of the noise and broke into a run. Lit for a moment in the doorway behind, another figure slipped silently and swiftly into the room. The hand was large and rough and smelled of fish. Nyssa had enough time to notice each of these facts and to let out the beginnings of a surprised shriek before the hand closed completely over her mouth. Her cry stopped as abruptly as her assailant grabbed her. Across the room, Nyssa could see the dark figure of Tegan and the hurried outline of the doctor as he arrived beside her and clasped her shoulders, asking her what was wrong. The tableau receded as Nyssa was pulled back through the room in the opposite direction. The man holding her grunted with the effort as he tried to prevent her from crying out or wrenching herself free. Nyssa bit and wriggled and stamped, but nothing she did seemed to shake her attacker's resolve or his grip. She pulled at the huge hand clamped to her mouth, but without success. In the distance, the doctor glanced briefly towards them. Nyssa could imagine him peering into the blackness and wondering where she was and what her stifled cry had been. Her eyes widened in blind appeal, and she struggled all the more violently. But the doctor turned back to Tegan, moved her aside, and started to examine the sarcophagus behind her. In a last desperate effort, Nyssa twisted in the doorway, her foot lashing out at a nearby display table, and her half-free hand catching at the doorframe as she was dragged from the room. "Look at the workmanship," the doctor said again, as he wiped imaginary dust from the figure's face. "Definitely a siren influence." He waved a hand at the stylized line of the eyebrows by way of proof. "Well, at least we know what drew the TARDIS off course." He turned back to Tegan, only slightly daunted by the fact that she appeared not to be paying any attention to him, and was instead looking round the room behind them. Probably caused the stabilizer failure too, come to that. He jammed his hands back into his pockets and leaned suddenly forwards. Tegan, if you don't want to know, then please don't ask. He finished off as if continuing the previous sentence. As he had suspected, she did not register the change of subject or the criticism. Where's Nissa? She asked instead. Oh, I expect she's... The doctor's expectations were cut short by the sound of a table crashing to the ground. The sound echoed round the room as the table spilled its contents across the floor. Something smashed in a minor explosion of plaster. Something else skidded and rolled across the ground, spinning to a stop at the edge of the carpet. Tegan and the doctor both turned towards the source of the noise, towards the far end of the room, and saw the silhouetted struggling as Nissa was dragged through the doorway by a large, dark figure. Hey! Tegan shouted. Tripping on the edge of her cloak, she tried to break into a run. As she stumbled, the doctor leaped past her and vaulted a collection of relics which stood between himself and the door. Behind him, he was aware of Tegan struggling with her cloak. In front of him, he saw Nissa finally disappear from view. The door slammed shut behind her. The door was unlocked, but the room beyond was empty. The doctor paused for the briefest of split seconds. Then he was off again, racing across the small room and crashing through the door at the end of it. He heard it bang into the wall in front of him and slam shut again behind him as he skidded down the stairs. He heard Tegan's muffled shouts as she followed. He caught the smallest glimpse of Nissa's flailing, trailing leg as it disappeared round a bend in the wide stone staircase ahead of him. But when he reached the landing below, there was no clue as to which way to go. The stairs continued on down, but 3 doorways gave out onto the floor he was now on. The doctor paused for breath and to listen for any hint which way to go. But all he could hear was Tegan clattering down the stairs behind him. Which way did they go? Tegan asked as she reached the landing, her cloak swirling behind her. The doctor adopted a pained expression. Do you really think I'd be hanging around here if I knew that? Great. So what do we do now? We think. Think? Yes, Tegan, think. It can be really quite useful. You should try it occasionally. Tegan snorted. And what good will thinking do, Nissa? We need to find her. For example, why do you think they, whoever they are, have taken her? It doesn't matter why, Doctor. We've got to find her. The doctor smiled and waved a finger at Tegan. But if we knew why, we might know where. As it is, we have to guess. And I would guess they're taking her somewhere else. Brilliant, Tegan said, sounding as though she actually meant something quite different. Tegan, admonished the doctor, somewhere else would suggest they're taking her outside the building, away from the museum. He nodded, primarily for his own benefit. So we need to be outside. We need to find their means of transport. Transport? They're not going to drag Nissa kicking and screaming through the streets of London now, are they? Would you? But the doctor did not wait for an answer to this. Instead, he started down the staircase again. Come along, he called back over his shoulder as he jumped down another 3 steps. The night air was cold and dry. What breath Nissa was able to exhale between the fingers of the clammy hand covering her mouth was forced through as a warm, humid mist which drifted and thinned into the foggy distance. Nissa had all but given up struggling, and was trying instead to slow her progress as much as possible. She had heard the clatter of pursuit, and her hope now was that the doctor could catch up with them. As she was dragged backwards out of a side entrance to the large building, Nissa had no way of knowing where she was headed, but she had a good view of where she had been. She spent little time in considering how much this was like travelling with the doctor, and more dragging her feet sluggishly through the thin sprinkling of snow which covered the frozen cobbles. Her heels bumped over the small rounded stones, and her calves were jarred by the jolting. Further back along the dark shadow of the building, another door was opened into the foggy night. It swung heavily outward and sprung back slightly as it reached the limit of its hinge. A moment later, the doctor bounded through the doorway, followed closely by Tegan. At the same instant, the man pulling Nyssa stopped. Nyssa's immediate thought was that the man would release her and make a run for it. The doctor and Tegan were now so close that they must catch him. The doctor was waving and shouting. Tegan was struggling to keep her cloak from under her feet. The fog parted before them as they dashed forward. But then Nyssa felt herself hoisted roughly up a couple of high steps and bundled through a small door. At the same time, the hand was released from her face and the ground jolted beneath her. She was thrown back onto an upholstered bench seat. In front of her, a pair of eyes gleamed darkly, and gaslight reflected for a second from the blade of a knife. Behind her, Nyssa could hear the doctor's continued shouts above the accelerating rhythm of the horse's hooves and the crack of the coachman's whip. The carriage was soon swallowed up by the foggy night. For a while, the sounds of the horse's hooves on the snowy cobbles and the clatter of the wheels made their increasingly muffled way through the thick fog. Only when they were gone did the doctor stop running. He drew in a deep breath, threw his rolled Panama hat down into the roadway, and carefully stamped on it. Tegan caught up with him just in time to see him retrieve the hat, unroll it, and dust it down on his coat, and jam the cold, soggy result back on his head. Then he sat down in the snow, pulled his knees up to his chest, and stared into the night. Tegan said nothing. She pulled her cloak closer round her and raised the deep hood, aware of the cold despite the enforced exercise. "That street lamp," the doctor nodded towards the nearest one. "Interesting, don't you think?" "No." Tegan crouched down beside him. "Doctor, we lost Nyssa." "Yes, I know," the doctor said without a trace of sarcasm. Rather, he seemed in a thoughtful mood. "And we'd better find her." He leaped to his feet and strode over to the lamppost. "Given the lighting technology, the ambient sound and," he waved an arm through the misty night, "pollution, I should say we're round about late Victorian." Tegan could see no reason to disagree. "Does that help?" The doctor thought for a moment. "Probably not," he admitted at last, "but I like to get things straight in my mind. And we still need an exact date to reset the TARDIS navigation systems." He walked round the lamppost, leaving a slushy trail in the snow. That Osiren lodestone must have picked up some residual vortex energy from the TARDIS time track. That would explain why we were drawn off course and might have caused the stabilizer failure. He stopped his circumnavigation and peered pensively at Tegan. Also, why the sarcophagus appeared to glow, probably leaking out the time differential to prevent a short. Does that help? Possibly, if the sarcophagus and Nyssa's kidnapping are connected, though I don't see how they could be. Perhaps this gentleman can enlighten us. It took Tegan a second to realise what the doctor had said. Then she looked round to see who he was talking about. She was still looking when she became aware of the sound of footsteps. Almost immediately, a figure pushed its way through the fog in front of them and stepped into the gaslight. The man was tall, his figure fleshed out by the cloak he wore. A tall black hat exaggerated his height as he walked towards them. His face, as it caught what light there was thin. He looked to be in his late 30s. "Ah, there you are," he said in a deep, measured voice. The doctor and Tegan exchanged glances. "You were expecting to find us here?" the doctor asked. "Indeed, sir." The stranger switched on a smile. "I have a communication." For us? Tegan pushed forward to see the man better. Something to do with Nissa? The man frowned and seemed genuinely surprised. To do with what? Tegan shrugged and turned away. The man continued, I'm sorry, Miss Jovanka. I did not understand the reference. Tegan stopped dead. You know who I am? She turned slowly back. The doctor, too, seemed surprised. Indeed. There was an awkward pause. Then the man seemed to sense that perhaps he needed to elaborate. How could I forget you so soon? He added helpfully. You've met before. The doctor gestured between the stranger and Tegan. The stranger laughed, a surprised rather than an amused laugh. But of course, he said. As you well know, Doctor. Tegan decided to try a different approach. How did you know we were here? The man shrugged. Lord Kenilworth said I would find you here, but if I had missed you, I assume you are still at the Savoy. Absolutely. The doctor moved Tegan aside and reached out a hand. Spot on. Now, about this communication. Of course, sir. The man fumbled inside his cloak and drew out an envelope. He handed it to the doctor. It's for tomorrow afternoon, as agreed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must be getting back. I still have various duties to discharge this evening. He bowed slightly to them both, then turned and walked into the fog. In the distance, Big Ben began to chime midnight. The doctor examined the envelope. He showed it to Tegan. On the front it was addressed in a neat, efficient hand to the doctor. Curiouser and curiouser, he muttered as he opened it. Tegan stood on tiptoes and looked over the doctor's shoulder as he pulled out the card inside. He glared at her briefly, and she smiled back. Then he held the card so they could both see it in the light from the gas lamp above. It was a plain white card, edged in gold. It was about 5 inches long by 3 inches high. Tegan read it twice. Lord Kenilworth, at home, Monday, 10th November, 1896. Kenilworth House, Embankment. A mummy from Egypt to be unrolled at 2:30. Not that unusual, Tegan, the doctor said after a while. These events were not uncommon. The Victorians loved to marry ceremony with antiquity and some semblance of learning. Maybe, Doctor, Tegan said, but I'd say it's pretty weird to get invited at midnight by a complete stranger to a mummy unwrapping party. The thin layer of snow cracked and collapsed under Tegan's feet. Her breath formed clouds in front of her face, and her feet ached. She felt as if they'd been walking for days, though she suspected that it was probably only about an hour all told. She was barely paying attention to the doctor's lecture on the history of Victorian London, and glanced only occasionally at the features of interest he pointed out along their route. He should get an umbrella and do the tour guide's job properly, she thought, as he took her arm again and waved a learned hand at yet another bridge across the Thames. But for the most part she was thinking about Nissa, and she suspected that behind his erudite manner the doctor was as well. Finally seeming to sense that he was making no progress in distracting Tegan, the doctor had quietened. They made their way along the embankment in silence, broken only by the background hum of the city and the foghorns of the boats on the river. A gaslight haze lay over the nearby rooftops, fading into gloom and darkness in the distance. "It smells," Tegan said at last. She felt this was a fair comment on the doctor's appreciation of Victorian architecture. "Smelt a good deal more before they put the sewer in," the doctor said, immediately back into his undaunted spiel. "All the sewage used to just go into the river. Now it gets carried 10 miles east." "What happens to it there?" The doctor lowered his head and kicked at a swell of soft snow. It exploded in a puff of white dust. "It just goes into the river at Barking," he muttered, and quickly went on. "Another marvellous feat of Victorian engineering." "A sewer?" Tegan was not convinced. "Hmm?" came the enthusiastic reply. "So where is it?" "Ah, well, they roofed it over and called it the Victoria Embankment." The doctor smiled through the gloom. "We're walking on it." He broke into a grin. "And we've arrived." Just ahead of them, Tegan could see the tall shape of Cleopatra's Needle cutting into the foggy sky. The bulky shape of a carved sphinx watched it diligently from beside them. Clawed hands of bronze gripped the edge of the stone plinth as the silent figure continued its vigil, poised to leap forward into the night. But the doctor was not interested. He had turned inwards and was pointing out a large rectangular building. The facade was lined with row upon row of large square windows, each row separated by a balcony. Just visible at the top of the building, flags hung limp from poles at each corner of the roof in the still night. Between the flags, lit from beneath and catching the vestiges of moonlight that struggled through the thick air, large capital letters proclaimed proudly, "Savoy Hotel and Restaurant." "Shall we, Miss Jovanka?" the doctor asked theatrically, as he waved an operatic hand to indicate a paved path through the line of young trees. Despite the lateness of the hour, the reception clerk was busily sorting through papers and allocating them to pigeonholes. The small square openings covered most of the wall behind the heavy mahogany desk, which itself occupied a fair extent of the far wall of the hotel lobby. The clerk looked round as the door opened to let in the doctor and Tegan. He was middle-aged, with slicked-back dark hair fashionably greased to his head. The doctor approached the desk, while Tegan waited at the back of the room. The clerk shot them a look of annoyance as Tegan glanced round the foyer. The area was large and ornate, as she had expected. The carpet was deep pile and deep red, and a huge staircase ascended from one corner of the reception area. Beyond it, a corridor led out of sight, while a pair of double doors stood propped open to reveal the glory of the dining room. Several immaculate waiters were making their weary way round the tables positioning cutlery. Tegan's sweeping gaze brought her attention back to the clerk, and she saw his expression transform into one of delight as the doctor approached the desk. He seemed to exude pleasure as he hurried to check a couple of pigeonholes and returned to the desk with a pair of heavy keys. "No messages, sir," he said before the doctor could say a word. "Not for you or for Miss Jovanka." He smiled across at Tegan, who frowned beneath her hood. Then he seemed to catch sight of the doctor's expression. "I'm sorry, sir. Were you expecting a communication?" He returned his attention to the pigeonholes. "Let me just check again." The doctor turned and shrugged. Tegan returned the gesture, unsure whether her cloak had masked the movement completely. "No, sir, nothing at all." "Well, never mind," the doctor reassured him. "Not your fault." "Your keys." The clerk handed them to the doctor. The doctor took the keys and started towards the staircase. He stopped abruptly in mid-stride and turned back to the desk. "There is one thing you could do for me." "Of course, sir. Anything." Tegan could see the edge of the doctor's hesitant smile. "Miss Jovanka and I have been discussing it, and we can't seem to quite remember. Tell me, how long have we been staying here?" The clerk's jaw dropped perceptibly. Exactly, that is." Still not convinced, the clerk reached under the desk and produced a heavy leather-bound book. He licked a suspicious index finger and rifled through the pages until he found what he was looking for. Finger-marking his place, he peered at the doctor slightly suspiciously. "You signed the guest register at 3:27, sir." The doctor's lips tightened and his eyes narrowed. Tegan could see he was wondering how to frame the next question. 3:27, he said at last. And that would be on, His voice trailed off into the embarrassed corners of the room. Yesterday, sir, the clerk said, with the slightest hint of a reprimand. The doctor nodded half-heartedly. See, Tegan, he said at length. I told you so. Tegan said nothing. She was tired, she was confused, she was cold, and she was worried about Nyssa. She stamped across the foyer and relieved the doctor of one of the keys, then continued towards the staircase. As she turned across the half-landing and ascended out of sight of the foyer, she could hear the clerk's muffled voice from below. I assume you remember the way to your room, sir? The doctor's voice followed. I don't suppose you'd like to remind me of the general direction. There was a pause, and Tegan could only guess at the clerk's expression. The doctor's voice became clearer as he hurried up the stairs after her. No, well, just a joke, he admitted unconvincingly. Ha-ha! It was something of a relief to eventually find rooms 106 and 107. It was also just as well, Tegan reflected, that the keys had numbered brass tags attached. The doctor motioned for Tegan to keep quiet as he silently slid the key to room 106 into the lock and slowly turned it. The lock clicked quietly, and the doctor flung open the door. The room appeared to be empty. The bed was turned down, and the curtains drawn. It appeared in every respect to be an ordinary, if somewhat plush, empty hotel room. The doctor grunted his disappointment and grinned at Tegan. Let's try 107. The procedure was repeated with the adjoining room. Tegan stood well clear as the doctor gave the door a hefty push to open it. He stared into the room for a moment, frowned, and then smiled at Tegan. That must be your room, I think. The doctor yawned, stretched, looked down his nose at her, and pushed past towards the open door to room 106. I'll see you in the morning, he said as he stepped out of sight. I need to think over a few things. I'll call you for breakfast at 8. His face suddenly reappeared in the doorway for a moment. Green's not really my colour, he said. Good night. Tegan watched the door to 106 close and heard the key turn in the lock. She had no idea what was going on, but at least she could get a few hours' sleep. Now at least she had a decent place for the night, and things could hardly get any more confusing. Then she stepped into her room. Laid out on the bed was a Victorian dress, trimmed at the neck and cuffs with delicate lace and pleated at the waist. It looked to be about the right size for Tegan. It was pale green. The dining room was surprisingly quiet. There seemed to be more waiters than guests at breakfast. Tegan felt decidedly overdressed until she entered the room. Then she transferred her social worries to her conspicuously short hair. The doctor, on the other hand, seemed to have made absolutely no concessions to the era or the establishment, and was acting as though he felt good about it. He was dressed, as always, in his cricketing gear and pale frock coat. He smiled affably at the staff and nodded politely to the guests. The only moment of uncertainty in his progress through the room as they followed a waiter to their table was when an old man, who had seemed to be asleep, mumbled, "Hello, doctor," as they passed. "Don't have the kippers," he added in a stage whisper as they were almost out of earshot. The waiter led them to a table by the window. Snow was still covering the ground outside, but it was a bright, crisp morning, the sun shining on the murky surface of the Thames, just visible between the young trees lining the embankment. It reflected, in rather more glory, from the bronze hide of one of the sphinxes guarding Cleopatra's Needle. "Ideal," the doctor told the waiter as he surveyed the scene. Then he yanked out a chair and sat down, legs immediately stretched out under the table. "Thank you, sir," the waiter smiled. "You did seem quite comfortable here last night." He pulled the opposite chair out for Tegan, pushing it gently into the backs of her knees and forcing her to sit suddenly and indecorously. "You mean at dinner?" the doctor hazarded. "Indeed, sir." Tegan gave a short, humourless laugh. She was getting used to everyone knowing where they had been and what they had done before they had even arrived. "I suppose you can remember what we had to eat too," she muttered. The waiter dropped a napkin into her lap. "You had the cutlets, Miss Jovanka. You expressed some disappointment, as I recall." He smiled at the doctor as he pulled the napkin from the doctor's glass and politely handed it to him, whereas the doctor was kind enough to compliment the chef on his oysters. He stepped back a pace, perhaps to double-check the perfect alignment of the table against the window. "Enjoy your breakfast, sir." With a slight bow, the waiter turned on his heels. "Madame?" His voice drifted back across his shoulder, as if as an afterthought. Tegan watched him across the dining room. When the waiter was well out of earshot, she leaned across the table and grasped the doctor's wrist. "Doctor, what's going on?" she asked. "And what are we going to do about Nissa?" The doctor was already busily checking the breakfast arrangements. He opened the lid of the heavy silver teapot and peered inside for a moment. Then he counted his way through the cutlery and checked the temperature of the toast in the rack. "Well," he said at last, "as to what's going on, I haven't a clue." He grinned. "Interesting, isn't it?" "And Nissa?" The doctor stopped midway through pouring the milk. "Yes," he said seriously. "Well, as I said last night, I think our best course is to attend this mummy party this afternoon and see what clues we can pick up there. And until then? Oh, come on, Tegan, first things first." He picked up the teapot. "And the first thing I need is a cup of tea." Kenilworth House was a large, imposing, stone-clad building several stories high. It was set back slightly from the embankment, the rear of the house looking out over the river. The doctor and Tegan followed a narrow footpath round to the front of the house and found themselves facing a large gateway. The heavy ironwork gate stood open, and a pair of carved jackals looked down at the doctor and Tegan as they passed. Tegan spared a hurried glance for the stone creatures as she and the doctor started up the driveway. The skidding of carriage wheels on the gravel and the encouraging call of a driver to the horses drew her attention back to the house. The carriage was pulling away from the porch, which jutted out over the front door, shielding it from the cold afternoon sun and shadowing on the woodwork. The bay windows on the upper floors leaned towards them as if watching as they approached. Tegan did not look back, for fear that the jackals on the gateposts had turned to monitor their progress. Instead, she followed in the doctor's footsteps as he crunched nonchalantly up the drive, hat on head and hands in pockets. The door was open before the doctor's hand reached the bell. It creaked inwards to reveal a tall, thin man. It was the same man who had handed the doctor the invitation the previous night. For a second, nobody moved. The man stood framed in the doorway. The doctor's hand hovered close to the bell pull. Tegan stood a step down from the doctor, a chill running up her spine. Then the moment was broken like the tension on a lake when the first drop of a thunderstorm splashes into it. "Who is it, Atkins?" a gruff voice called from inside the house. The man in the doorway, Atkins, stepped back, opening the door fully and gesturing for the doctor and Tegan to enter. "The doctor, sir," Atkins said as they entered the hallway, "and Miss Jovanka." The next few minutes seemed almost like a dream when Tegan tried to recall them afterwards. She remembered being greeted by Lord Kenilworth in the hallway. She was not quite sure how they knew it was Lord Kenilworth. Perhaps they did not find out until later. But whoever they thought he was, The large man in his 40s was genuinely pleased to see them. He seemed to radiate equal amounts of pleasure, relief, and excitement as he pumped the doctor's hand and clapped Tegan on the shoulder. "Thank heavens, Doctor," he chuckled loudly. "I know you said you'd probably be late, but you cut it a bit fine. We were quite worried, actually. Thought we might have to delay the big moment. Can't start without you, after all. Not after everything we've been through, eh?" "Quite," the doctor muttered, as he allowed himself to be led to the drawing-room. Tegan hurried after them, trying not to trip over the hem of her dress. The drawing-room was big and square. The dark walls were hung with portraits, the only subject Tegan recognised being Queen Victoria. A large fireplace dominated one wall, the burning logs sparking and crackling and throwing shadows of the people in front of it. And the room was full of people, or at least that was the impression Tegan got. Thinking back later, she decided there could only have been perhaps a dozen guests. But as they all stopped in mid-conversation and turned to watch her enter the room behind the doctor and Kenilworth, they seemed like a multitude. The small crowd parted for the approaching doctor as if he were Moses. People stepped back respectfully, clearing a way through to the far corner of the room, to the area below Queen Victoria's stern vigil, to the sarcophagus. "I think, Doctor, that we might as well start right away," Kenilworth said as they approached the trestles on which the ornate mummy case rested. "Professor Macready has kindly offered to assist." Macready was a small man with little round glasses and thin grey hair. He stood the other side of the sarcophagus, so his head seemed almost to rise out of it. He gave a nod and a smile as the doctor and Tegan arrived at the coffin, as if they were old friends. Around its sides, Tegan could see rows of intricate hieroglyphics, centuries old, blackened and beginning to fade. The coffin itself was shaped like a child's rough outline of a broad human form, arms pressed to the sides of the body, feet together. The lid had been removed from the sarcophagus. Tegan stood at the foot of the case as she looked inside. Her head was whirling. She was not sure quite what was going on or why they were there. Some part of her mind was aware that the doctor and Macready were shaking hands across the sarcophagus, across the mummified body laying inside. Another part of her brain was beginning to realise that the doctor was intended to perform the unwrapping, to remove the bandages from the body that had lain undisturbed inside the coffin for millennia. "How old, do you think?" the doctor asked, as he and Macready surveyed the bandaged form inside. "Oh, I agree with you, Doctor." Macready's voice was thin and reedy. His glasses caught the flickering firelight as he surveyed the ancient form. 4,000 years at least. He drew a pale hand up the length of the body. "The sarcophagus is, as you rightly surmised, of the Middle Kingdom, and the bandages themselves would seem to date from the same period." He peered closely at one of the bulges wrapped close into the side of the body. "Notice how the bandage is rotting over this arm, Doctor." The doctor and Tegan both craned forward to see. "This side too," the doctor observed. "Indeed," Macready nodded slowly. The crowd was leaning forward too now, too polite to press closer, but eager to hear and see the deliberations. "You will also notice," Macready continued, "that the legs are not so closely bound as one might expect." He poked a thin finger at the wrappings. They gave slightly at his touch. "Do you think they were loosened after burial?" the doctor asked slowly. Again Macready nodded. "Unusual, I know, but possible. One does hear rumours that this happened, though this would be the first case documented so thoroughly." "What?" Tegan asked. "What are you saying? That someone loosened the bandages? Someone tried to unwrap the mummy?" The doctor took a step towards Tegan. He seemed unsure whether to put his hand on her shoulder, and eventually settled for resting it on the lip of the coffin. "Professor Macready is suggesting, and I think he is correct, that this poor unfortunate was bandaged up and then buried while still alive." "That's horrible!" Tegan wanted to turn away, but instead she leaned closer and looked into the bandaged face. It seemed so calm now, just decaying, stained cloth. She tried to imagine the figure writhing and twisting, tried to imagine the heavy lid of the sarcophagus thumping down and entombing the still struggling form, tried to imagine the darkness and the terror. 4,000 years ago, she murmured as the doctor reached into the coffin. With Macready's help, the doctor managed to tease free a corner of bandage with a pair of tweezers that he had produced from somewhere. He held the edge of material for a moment, looking round the faces of the assembled crowd. Kenilworth nodded to him, and the doctor tugged gently. The bandage pulled free and began to unravel like an old sweater. As Tegan watched in horrified amazement, the cloth fell away from the mummy's head. She watched in fascination, ready to look quickly away when the full horror of the face was revealed. She could imagine it already, the smell of the rotting bandages evoking half-remembered images of mummified faces from forgotten textbooks and childhood museum trips. 4,000 years. But as the flesh beneath the bandages glimpsed into view, it did not seem to have the pitted grey pallor of decay. Instead, it looked smooth and white. "Good grief," Tegan heard Macready mutter, as a mass of brown hair untangled from the wrappings. "Is this why you wouldn't let us examine her until now?" "Oh no," the doctor breathed, a telltale hand gripping the side of the sarcophagus. Tegan said nothing. From the end of the coffin, she could see clearly the whole of the mummy. She could see the 4,000-year-old wrappings as they clung loosely to the bandaged form. She could see the tattered ends of the cloth pulled from the mummy's head. She could taste the stench of decomposition and decay rising from the corpse's ancient shroud, and she could feel the weight in her stomach lifting and rising in her throat as she looked at the face of the mummy. The face was perfectly preserved. The eyes were shut, the mouth closed. The hair was a tangled mess from the millennia it had spent woven into the bandages. And now that she could see the face, Tegan could recognize the shape of the rest of the body, outlined by the sarcophagus and by the rotting cloth. The figure in the coffin, dead for over 4,000 years, was Nyssa. The Legend of Osiris. When Osiris the king returned victorious from the campaign, his brother Seth feigned friendship. Together with Nephthys, his sister-wife, Seth invited Osiris to a great banquet to celebrate his safe return. Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris, and the sister of Nephthys and Seth, begged her husband not to attend, fearing some treacherous intent. But Osiris was in good humour, magnanimous in victory. He spoke to Isis, and together they agreed to go to the palace of Seth. Seth had organised a great feast. There were grapes and figs, calves' heads, the forelegs of oxen, and hearts of cows. There were geese and ducks. The wine flowed freely, and all the royalty and dignitaries of Egypt were in attendance. Osiris was the guest of honour, made welcome by his brother Seth. He was seated at the head of the table, as befitted his position. And his brother Seth and his sisters Isis and Nephthys made merry with him. Then, when the feast was ended and the wine was almost gone, Seth had a great sarcophagus brought into the banqueting hall. It was traced in gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli. The casket was the best workmanship of the greatest craftsman in all the kingdoms of Egypt. And Osiris asked his brother for whom such a rich gift could be intended. Seth let it be known that the sarcophagus was a prize, the greatest prize in history. And the prize would be won by the man who best fitted the sarcophagus, that it should bear him in glory into the afterlife. So the nobility of Egypt each tried the casket for size, eager to win so great a gift from the brother of the king. but they were each by turns too short or too tall, too fat or too thin, and it seemed that none of the guests could win so great a prize. Then Nephthys urged her brother Osiris to try the casket himself. Osiris at first declined, his wife Isis fearing some entrapment, but Seth laughed at his brother's apprehension, and Osiris agreed to try the test. So Osiris lowered himself into the casket, laughing with his brother Seth. It fitted Osiris as if it had been made for him, and so it had. When Osiris was lying in the casket, Seth slammed shut the lid and, still laughing, he sealed it. Then he called his guards and had the coffin hurled into the Nile. As the coffin floated into the night, Seth's laughter mingled with the grief of Isis, and the tears of Isis dripped into the river and flowed after the entombed body of her brother and husband Osiris. And Nephthys saw her sister's grief, and she found it good. Translated by Tobias Singent from the inscriptions of the tomb of An-Akka.